Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Top Lessons podcast with your host, Kathy Englad. And today we have a very special host. Her name is Julie Rose. Welcome, Julie. Thank you so much for joining.
Kathy, it's my pleasure to be your guest.
Thank you. And for those of you, I'm going to give a little background on Julie because you may know her already from her very famous podcast, Top of Mind. And if you don't, here's the background on this infamous radio journalist. Julie has over 20 years in radio journalism. She has appeared on many networks like The Morning Edition and All Things Considered. She has over 7 years, which she was hosting a live radio show on BYUradio and Sirius XM 143. And recently, not so recently, I should say, it's been a few years, she has become the host and executive producer of Top of Mind with Julie Rose. And most recently, a new podcast called Uncomfy, Sticking with Moments That Challenge Us. Julie, oh my God, are you doing enough to keep busy?
It's a good thing I love it, right?
And good thing you're so good at it. You have topics that really are, to put it in quotes, top of mind. Just to name a few, and podcasts that really resonated with me. Election integrity, right? Like, oh my God, we have the election in 4 days. Like, can that be any more a hot topic? We have big money in elections. We have the jury process. You talked about gun violence. Tipping culture, which that was a great one. I loved tipping culture because I think I have so many friends that talk about this all the time. And then the union expansion process and where has that gone in this country. But most of all, you have this ability to bring together your guests that I call have heated civility. And it's this amazing way which you bring together differences of opinion. They're a little uncomfortable, and you do it in a way that is informative. What lessons do you think have taught you to be that type of host that allows for people to have heated civility?
I love that term, heated civility. One of the things that inspired us to create this podcast was that, it was inspired by my own experience, feeling frustrated with the way that news consumption was leaving me feeling, just angry, depressed, overwhelmed. And I realized that some of that had to do with the fact that it just felt like there was constantly people giving their best sound bites to kind of like take down the other side or convince me that they're right and everybody else is wrong or misguided. And it didn't feel like there was enough nuance, especially in stories and interviews and podcasts about some of these really tough topics where I actually wanted to feel surprised and feel curious rather than just sort of have my curiosity shut down. And so the main thing that I've learned, because we set out to be like, how could we do something different? How could we take these topics that you could turn on the TV and you can hear a couple of pundits giving their hot takes on any of these topics on any given day, right? It's not like they're not being talked about, but what could we do that would leave people feeling optimistic and empowered and curious to learn more rather than send us into our corners? And probably the first thing and the very most important thing I've learned throughout this process is that curiosity is thrilling. When you have one of those moments as you're listening to a podcast and you're like, or a conversation and you're like, I never thought of it that way before. Or that is a viewpoint that completely is outside of my life experience. And to be able to stay curious about that and want to be like, I'd like to know more, or I'd like to go have a conversation with someone about that. Now that I'm kind of seeing this from a slightly different perspective, to find that thrilling rather than threatening, requires us to keep our curiosity on, like to keep flexing our curiosity muscle and keep wanting to ask questions rather than to just be like, all of a sudden my worldview is shifting a little bit and I'm panicking about that and I got to turn that off. And that's what that threat response is driven by emotion. So the biggest lesson I've learned is that in order to, I think, engage productively with really tough topics, we need to be okay hearing perspectives that challenge us and expand our worldview. And the only way to do that and stay curious is to be aware of how our emotions shut that down.
Yes. I totally see that.
And to take some control and ownership of that process as we're listening or reading.
And you do it in such a fantastic way. I think one of, especially the integrity election process show where you could see the guest at the end was like, wow, I didn't see it this way. I have more clarity now. I have now more trust in the process. I know more about it now to not have those questions that I did before. And I think as the phenomenon of children to adults, we are curious as children, right? That's where every child is. We ask why a million times. But yet as adults, we shut that down because we think we don't want to come across as, ignorant or not as, educated. We lose that curiosity because we may want to ask those 20 whys, but we just think, it's not important for me to know all those things. And it takes a special person to actually, continue learning. I think listening to podcasts like yours really, really helps to educate the everyday listener on topics that are really top of mind and also uncomfortable.
And I really try. Yeah, uncomfortable. And that's the thing. I love it when people say, oh, you asked the question that I want to ask, that I would want to ask, but maybe was a little afraid to ask. I've sort of taken it as my mantra that I will do it fearlessly for you. I'm here for you as the listener. And, I'm your advocate here. I'm feeling a little uncomfortable. I'm going to push through this because I know that this is probably on somebody else's mind too. I'm going to ask that. I don't get it. Or, but why? But how do you reconcile this with that? I think a lot of times we've sort of programmed ourselves to believe that asking questions or probing a little more deeply is going to lead to some kind of conflict, and conflict is automatically terrible. But in fact, the clash of ideas and where things kind of rub up against each other is actually where the really interesting moments of insight come along. And I'm trying to create those moments for our listeners where a light bulb flashes on or a little crack in their worldview opens up just enough that they don't freak out, but that they're like, well, that's interesting.
Yeah.
And want to learn more.
Yeah, for sure. And I think that's where you obviously an award-winning journalist. You've won the Edward R. Murrow Awards a few times. You've won the Gracie Award for radio hosting. So suffice it to say, you're really good at what you do.
Thanks.
And at the same time, we are in this world of extreme views, right? We have so many people on both ends of the spectrum. But yet we're trying to bring people kind of to the middle to say, have that healthy discussion, that healthy discord, because we're able to have a democracy where people have different views. But we're not able to, I almost, from watching the news probably a little too much, I almost wish that people didn't cross that line. Because when you hear it, when people cross the line, you go, oh, this is where the conversation goes nowhere now. And you definitely maintain within the line where you are allowing people to speak about what they think really and why, but yet they stay above the line where, people are still respectful to one another. Mm-hmm. How do you think you've maintained that? Because you went from live radio to now podcasting, which is a very different format. But yet you maintain that professionalism where you literally allow people to, express themselves freely.
So one thing I will say is that people might be thinking live radio, oh, she was a talk radio person, a pundit. Actually, I wasn't that. So It was 7 years of interviews, live interviews. My training is in public radio, so I was doing reporting for national public radio programs and local public radio stations. And then when I came to BYU Radio, I started hosting a daily live interview show where my job was to do a ton of prep and then speak to someone who I'd never spoken to before we go live on the radio. And I have 20 minutes to make this an interesting conversation for our listeners. And I got a lot of really good practice over 7 years of trying to figure out how to introduce some balance into those conversations because my guests would have an opinion and I wanted to kind of put myself in the mindset that would challenge that opinion that someone else might have if it was a hot topic, right? And be able to sort of channel a different worldview and be able to ask some questions so that we could get to some more clarity and find some common ground. And so I was never about sharing my own views. And one of the things that I learned pretty early on was that it was not going to be effective if my goal was to get to understanding and to stay in civil, a heated civil conversation. I was going to have to create a certain amount of trust with the guest. They needed to be able to trust that I had their interests and the listener's interests in mind, and that my only goal in asking, and I think this is a lesson we can all take into our conversations with people who maybe we disagree with or who we're unclear about their worldview, right? That my goal was to better understand and help them to better, more fully express themselves so that the listener could more deeply understand. So oftentimes people would get off the phone with me. I would hear after the fact, they're like, I was terrified to do a 20-minute live interview with you, but that was the most exhilarating interview I've done of all the interviews I've ever done on this topic. And they would say that because they felt like they really got to the bottom of it. And they were really, because I was coaxing them and saying, okay, but how about this? But I don't fully understand. Like, I wasn't going to let them get away with just sort of the top line. They could sense that I really was curious, and that when I was asking a challenging question, it wasn't because I wanted to get them. It was because I wanted to help them to fully express themselves and make their best argument, right, for their issue or their expertise. And so that was one of the things I learned early on, is that I wasn't going to be able to do that if I was bringing on live people in opposition to one another, like crossfire style.
Yeah, it would be
right?
like boxing style.
Yeah, that, like, to do a live debate on the radio, that was another thing.
Yeah.
And you can watch cable news and get that all day long. So we needed to do something where I needed to be able to create an environment of trust in this live conversation where we could really go deep and get the listener to some understanding.
I totally see how the prep work that you do is so important to having that honest conversation, because, you know, people want to know that you took the time and effort to understand their point of view. But yet in conversations with one another, we very rarely do that prep, right? We very rarely understand the person's background or context. We just jump into something that they said that we didn't like. And I think that's where, you know, listening to your podcast and listening to, you know, I would say less news, because news is more about that back and forth boxing match. But listening to your podcasts tells you have to have an open mind, but yet you have to do the research to be able to give a respectful response, because people really do value an opinion that is backed up with some certain level of research or understanding. And, like, you know, it's the type of conversation where you say, well, why do you think that? And the answer is, I don't know, I just think that, right? And you're like, well, there you go. You lost all respect right there.
Yeah. You know, what's interesting, though, I will add just that when I'm interviewing someone, well, I see our podcast, I see Top of Mind in particular as practice. What I really hope is that people will listen to my episode on trust in elections, election integrity, why people lose trust, how we could rebuild that trust, why people across the spectrum tend to lack trust for different reasons, the political spectrum, that they'll listen to that, and that will give them just a little bit of practice and a little bit of insight to be able to have a better footing when they engage in a conversation with someone about that topic, and it turns out they disagree. But the other thing I've learned, so I hope it's practice, but also you can still, when someone says, well, I just believe that, you know, when you're asking someone, why do you believe that? And they say, well, I just believe that. The other lesson you can take from the way that what I've learned as a journalist is that there's a way to ask a follow-up question that will actually continue the conversation and maybe actually get to something better and more productive. And that is to focus on that individual's experience, focus on the individual rather than the issue. So if they're ready to shut you down because they're like, I just believe it, they feel like you're trying to force them to defend themselves. And you can turn that around very quickly by asking a question like, how did you learn to value this so much? Who taught you this? Where did this come from in your life? Or can you tell me a story? Share an experience from your life that shapes your view on this topic.
And I love that, because I really do think as a society we have more shared values than we admit. I think when we talk about it and we express our values, we really do connect on those shared values. And without probing that person to speak more about why they think something, you really do lose that, like, oh, I would have connected with them, but I just didn't actually ask and get to know them more. As, you know, children, going back to, you know, how we're brought up, we have this experience where, you know, we're not born to hate. We're not born to disagree. We learn those because that's the way we were raised, or, you know, the circumstances we were in. But yet, you know, down the road where we forget that the person next to me is also human and also has flaws the same way we do, we also know that we have shared values that we obviously will agree on, I'm sure. We just haven't agreed yet to those values because we haven't asked about them. And I think that's really a fantastic way in how you present those hot topics where, you know, we are constantly seeing about, you know, the election process and the integrity of it, and people's views just come out because, you know, that's what they read on a headline once. And and they really didn't read the article that, supported that headline. But it is, very welcoming to see how you express those views in Top of Mind. But now switching a little bit, because you now have a new podcast that you just started this year, Uncomfy, which I love, by the way. Just the word is very catchy. Why start a new podcast?
Yeah, so this is, it's an addition. Top of Mind still drops every other week, and Uncomfy drops once a week. And this actually came out of the experience that I was having as we were making Top of Mind for the first couple of years, where I came to realize that there was a specific thing that was required. I was asking listeners to be willing to stay a little uncomfortable. As they were listening to the podcast, my one promise to you is that no matter what your view is on the issue of the day, you're going to hear something that's going to make you're going to disagree with. And that's naturally going to feel a little uncomfortable. And your natural inclination might be to turn it off. And I want you to stay with me. I'm doing everything I can to make my storytelling engaging and to have the perspectives be nuanced so that you'll keep listening, because only when you keep listening, that's where the understanding comes in, right? But this whole being willing to stay a little uncomfortable when what we really want to do is lash out or bail out, right? That's a skill in and of itself. And I realize that we have opportunities to do that every single day in our lives, whether it's getting some tough feedback that that's hard to hear, or whether it's, realizing maybe we fell a little short in a relationship or in a work assignment, or it's encountering someone who really disagrees with us, or just getting outside of our comfort zone, being the minority of something in a room full of people who are different than you, right? All of these things are an opportunity to stay a little uncomfortable, stay curious and open, and see what you might learn as a result. So that became the premise of Uncomfy, is talking to people who tell us stories about doing that in their daily lives. One story, 15 or so minute episodes. It's on video.
I love it.
And it's just another way to kind of supplement and help us see how to be better at this in our lives.
Yeah, and I think that topic can transcend everything, right? It's really, like you mentioned, in the workplace. You could talk about that just in the workforce all day, every day, right? Mm-hmm. Because obviously your background is journalism, but you couldn't be uncomfortable in Wall Street, in marketing, and you name the industry, right? You're
well, that's where the growth happens, right? When you're willing to kind of push a little beyond what feels safe to you.
For sure. And I think that's going to resonate with a lot of people, because at the same time, I always say you want to respond and not react. There's a slight difference between those two, because with reacting, you're hot, you're heavy, you're coming in with all your emotions. But when you respond, you have that, macro view of what am I about to say, and will it hurt or help? And I love that type of conversation, because it really teaches people to be like, hold on, give yourself that 24 hours maybe, or that 10 minutes before you go, all out your true self.
Or those 3 mindful breaths.
Oh, yes.
Just
it's like,
regulate your autonomic nervous system. Yeah.
Well, Julie, it's been a pleasure to have you here. But before I let you go, I want to ask one question, because I think you are a very successful woman in your industry. I have this statement where I say, see it, be it. And I think when someone sees you, they want to potentially be someone like you, have this amazing career, successful, live air, podcasting now. And what would you say to that new college graduate or that young high schooler that wants to be you one day, that you wish you would have learned 20 plus years ago? What do you think as a journalist would have helped you if someone just said, hold on, if you come in with this advice or lesson, it'll help you so much faster?
The world of journalism has changed so dramatically, even since I started 20 years ago. And the thing that I think journalists just have to understand today, whether you're new or whether you're an old timer, right, is that we can no longer assume that people will trust us because we say we're being objective.
Yeah.
The news media world is so fragmented, and trust in the news media is so low that it is incumbent on us. It's not enough just to report what happened. We have to be actively seeking to make sure that we're overcoming our own biases, because we all have them, even if we don't want to admit them. Yeah. We have to be actively working to make sure that we're not allowing our blind spots to guide the way we're reporting a story. And most importantly, and this is something that a lot of us in journalism are only just now starting to realize and do more intentionally, but it is our job to build trust with our listeners and readers and viewers. And we have to do that by being accountable, by acknowledging publicly when we make mistakes, by acknowledging our biases, and by being very transparent in the way that we're doing our work and why we're covering a specific story. Because there is so little trust right now that people are not going to consume our work. And we can't just wait for that to get better. We have to, as journalists, earn that trust back from our readers and listeners and viewers.
Which, for those of you listening, is a great lesson to learn, but also a lesson that can transcend many industries. You know, accountability is every industry out there. And if we make a mistake, we should own it, because at the end of the day, there's no reason to, shy away from something, because you'll never get better or you'll never gain that trust back again. So on that note, Julie, thank you so much for being here with me today and for all your great experience and all the lessons you've learned. So if we could summarize it, I think, can I just say one of the messages from this conversation is to stay curious. Stay curious 100%. And open-minded, and hopefully, the next topic you'll hear on Julie's podcast, Top of Mind, will make you interested and be more curious about the topics that she's going to present in the near future. Now, this tape will tape after the election, so we will obviously have maybe a different world where we're living in, and maybe Julie will have to do a follow-up just to see how the world has changed in a few weeks or months. But I look forward to our continued partnership, and please subscribe to both Julie's podcasts and the Top Lessons, and we'll, hopefully get a like from you and any questions you may have for us thereafter. So thank you, Julie, once again for your time.
It's been a great pleasure. Good luck in your work, Kathy.
Thanks so much. Bye.